Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the final event in the series, With You or Not at All, Race and Women's Suffrage. I'm Leslie Harris, Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University. For the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the Frances Willard House, Jane Addams Hull House Museum of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Northwestern University have collaborated to commemorate this important history and Illinois' place within it. In our commemoration, we have sought to center the complicated history of race as a central theme in the history of the struggle for the vote for women. We will hear tonight from three experts on these three women for our panel Race and Rights, Ida B. Wells, Frances Willard, and Jane Addams. We will hear about their attitudes and activism, or lack of it, about race and racism, and their activism as women. We can't really understand and represent properly the history of the movement for women's equality in the United States without understanding its roots in the struggle against the enslavement of people of African descent and the struggle for racial equality. The pre-Civil War anti-slavery movement, which addressed both the wrongs of slavery and the issue of racial equality, provided the ground upon which women began to challenge their own lack of equality. Black and white women in the antebellum period literally found their public voices through the struggle against racism and slavery. The first woman to speak on secular topics before quote unquote promiscuous audiences of men and women was a woman of African descent, Maria Stewart of Boston, who lectured about racial inequality and lectured against slavery. And the anti-slavery movement struggled as much with the role of women as equal partners there as it did with issues of racism and slavery. The interracial beginnings of the anti-slavery movement and of women's activism within it did not mean that Black and white women managed to maintain partnerships as they fought for women's equality. The three women we will discuss tonight, Frances Willard, Ida B. Wells, and Jane Addams, are all citizens of Illinois who struggled greatly with the meaning of race and racism amid the push for women to have a greater voice within the politics of the nation. In focusing on them tonight, we also highlight the history of Illinois as central to issues of women, race, and citizenship in the nation. Our collaboration tonight is also rooted in an event launch that we participated in with the Frances Willard House. In spring 2019, the Frances Willard House launched a website called Truth Telling that discussed the conflict between Women's Christian Temperance Union Director Frances Willard and the crusading Black journalist Ida B. Wells. Willard and Wells clashed over Willard's cautious approach to denouncing the lynching of Black men in the Southern states. Frances Willard, the descendant of an anti-slavery family, feared offending Southern women more than she supported the equality of Black people. Willard died in 1898 before she and Wells repaired their relationship. But as we'll learn tonight, Willard's approach to issues of race as a white woman was not the only approach. In the first decades of the 20th century, as women worked towards the achievement of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and as they continued into the 1930s, issues of race continued to be central to women's movements, and particularly to the suffrage movement. Indeed, the title of our series, With You or Not at All, is taken from Ida B. Wells' refusal to march in a segregated section of the 1913 National Suffrage Parade. Women were organized by state. Illinois' women were one of three state groups that had at least one Black member. And Ida B. Wells, in fact, did march with the Illinois contingent. By the time of the 1913 parade, Jane Addams was rising in stature. If we are thinking generationally, Wells and Addams are part of the same generation. They were born and passed away within 5 years of each other. However, all of these generations were steeped in white supremacy. Jane Addams, as we'll learn tonight, improved on Frances Willard's relative lack of support for racial equality and was praised for that by some of the founders of the NAACP. But she was also self-critical about her own limits and the limits of the white women she worked with. Examining the lives of these three women, Frances Willard, Ida B. Wells, and Jane Addams, provides us with an opportunity to think about, meditate on the slow pace of historical change when issues of racial and gender equity are involved, even when we witness some enormous changes. Frances Willard and Ida B. Wells both lived through the end of slavery and the all too brief electoral successes of African Americans in the post-Civil War South. Both also lived through the horrific backlash to racial progress, the disenfranchisement of African Americans, and racial violence so horrific that it was termed the nadir by subsequent historians. Wells, of course, rose to the occasion as an activist against racism. Willard, despite her anti-slavery family history, did not speak out as strongly as the radical abolitionists had against slavery, nor did she speak out as strongly as she did against the scourge of alcohol. Jane Addams, in contrast to Willard, was more forthright, and yet in her own self-assessment did not do as much as she could have. This panel is occurring exactly 2 weeks following Election Day, which of course turned into Election Week. It is not lost on any member of this panel tonight that this election occurred in a year when racial inequities were highlighted by the pandemic and by flagrant white supremacist violence. The election itself was for many an opportunity for the nation to make a strong referendum on 4 years of struggle against racism and voter suppression encouraged by the very leaders of our nation. Yet so far, only a slim majority, almost 51%, although we're still counting ballots, voted against the toxic anti-immigration, racist, and nationalist policies of the current administration. The removal from office of a president who, even before his election, long before, had weaponized and encouraged racist, nationalist, and gendered forms of violence was made possible by the dedicated labor of Black people and centrally of Black women. And yet we see that power resisted. We wait to see who will stand up for voting rights for all and who will continue to undermine the will of the majority. With our current dis-ease, unease as backdrop, tonight we will go back roughly 100 years to see what we can learn of persistence in the pursuit of equity and of the possibilities and the limits in terms of interracial cooperation for equity. Our example tonight is women's suffrage and political activism among Black and white women. But the lessons of collaboration are important for all of us in this multiracial country and this multinational world. Before I go further, I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's events. Many of you are joining us via a Zoom link. In addition, the following libraries are sharing the program on their Facebook pages: Gail Borden Public Library District, Schaumburg Township District Library, Aurora Public Library, Arlington Heights Memorial Library, and the Reaching Across Illinois Library System, or RAILS. I'd also like to thank the team at Color World Creative Company. Company founder Amanda Garcia has provided critical technical expertise to us, and Katie Krantz has created our wonderful slides for tonight. So for the rest of our program, tonight I will introduce each of our panelists who will then speak for about 5 minutes. Then we will have a conversation about these historical women and the themes that their political activism raises. During that time, please place any questions or comments you have in the Q&A, which we will be monitoring. We will then wrap our conversation, and Ross Jordan of Hull House Museum will join us to share the questions you have for our panelists. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Our first panelist is Lori Osborne, director of the Frances Willard House. As director, Lori led the project to recover the history of the controversy between Frances Willard and Ida B. Wells, a history that had been buried and forgotten. A team of scholars and researchers led to the creation of the award-winning truth-telling website, which provides the primary documents and historical context for the controversy over Willard's limited criticism of the practice of racial violence in the late 19th century South and Ida B. Wells's exposure of Willard's lack of support. Lori Osborne is also the director of the Evanston Women's History Project, a community-wide project to document the significant contributions Evanston women have made to the community. She currently serves on the board of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, which works to increase the level of women's history interpretation at all historic sites. And she is the Illinois coordinator for the Votes for Women Trail, which is an NCWHS project in honor of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Thank you, Lori. Unmute, Lori.
Do I need to do that too? Okay, now you can hear me. Thanks so much, Leslie. And I'm very glad to be part of the program tonight, and want to thank all the sponsors and everyone, including the other panelists who've helped to plan it and make it possible. We've had some great conversations getting ready for this, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting discussion that we're going to have. I thought I would start, though, with a brief introduction about Willard's life, because of the three women we're discussing tonight, Willard is probably the least known today. But she was, interestingly, probably the most known for at least some of the time period we'll be speaking about, the 1890s, when they all would have been working in reform in Chicago at the same time. Willard died in 1898. So the time period when all three of them would have been working together is that 1890s time period. So a little bit about Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. Willard was born in 1839, which places her in the second generation of leaders in the women's rights movement. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton are the generation before her. Those names are familiar to most people. And Addams and Wells are the generation following Willard. So it's important to note where she sort of sits. She's coming in the middle. There's an important transition that's going on in the work for women's rights. And Willard actually is a key figure in these years in that transition. Willard started her working life as an educator, school teacher, but shifted to the temperance movement in the 1870s when it became a women's-centered movement. She saw potential not only for attacking a key issue affecting women's lives, alcohol and alcoholism, but growing women's public role in their communities and advancing women's rights more broadly in this new organization. As the second president of the WCTU from 1879 to 1898, Willard was known for giving the organization a broader focus, working on everything from women's suffrage, which was a quite radical thing at the time for an organization to take on, to labor reforms, prison reforms, education reforms, a broad social reform agenda. By the mid-1890s, the time period we're talking about, the WCTU was the largest organization of women in the United States and had grown into a worldwide and diverse, for its time, organization. As Leslie mentioned, Willard and her family had been abolitionists before the Civil War, and she carried this legacy into her work for the WCTU. Willard encouraged Black membership and leadership in the WCTU at a time when most women's organizations were not integrated at all. Black women were involved in local, state, and national WCTUs throughout the United States, mostly in the North, but really all over. And sometimes they were integrated with white women, but more often they were separate chapters based in women's churches. They were sort of an extension of your church women's organization groups. However, Willard also carried with her a middle-class white woman's limited perspective on race. And she made public comments that were demeaning to Black people and other people of color. She also believed and encouraged racist stereotypes and did not speak out strongly against lynching, as you also mentioned, Leslie. And it is this lack of moral leadership that really brought her into direct conflict with Wells. Michelle will speak a little bit more about Wells, but I'll just summarize the conflict between Willard and Wells briefly. By 1895, Wells's anti-lynching campaign was well underway, but she was frustrated by the reluctance of influential right reformers like Willard to join her. In 1890, Willard had made some racially charged statements in a newspaper interview, and Wells had seen and remembered the interview. While on a speaking tour of England in 1894, Wells republished the interview and made public her criticisms of Willard's leadership. And at first, Willard tried to defend herself against Wells's criticisms, but in the face of mounting pressure, she eventually took measures to address the issue. including speaking out publicly against lynching. The WCTU passed anti-lynching resolutions in 1894, 1895, and several years following. But Willard died in 1898 without this really being resolved fully. At the Willard House several years ago now, our staff and board made a commitment to tell this story. The full story can be found on the Truth Telling website. I can't go into the complicated nature of it right now, but I can't say enough about the team who worked on this, including Leslie and others at NU, at Northwestern, at Loyola University, and the exhibit curator, Ella Wagner. I want to conclude, though, with some thoughts on what we do with imperfect leaders. Willard was often portrayed as a saint who could do no wrong. And our goal here at the Willard House is really to let her be fully human with failings and unmet challenges unresolved in her life. We felt that this might present a new way to learn from the past. It might inspire future leaders by creating a new kind of leadership model. So a question I think we're probably going to talk about tonight, and along with lots of other questions, is how do we reckon with historical figures who fought against one form of oppression, like the oppression of women, while shoring up other kinds of oppression? And what do we do with their legacy, and how do we remember them and carry that forward today? I look forward to more discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lori, for starting us off. We'll now turn to Michelle Duster. Michelle Duster is an author, professor, public historian, and champion of racial and gender equity. She has initiated and supported dozens of local, state, and national initiatives to have street names, markers, murals, and monuments honoring her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, and other African-American female historic figures. She has worked in a number of media over the years on PBS documentary films, organized several film festivals, and in the last dozen years, she has written articles for Time, Essence, HuffPost, Teen Vogue, and the North Star. She has also appeared on MSNBC, CNN, WTTW, CBS, and CW, as well as numerous radio shows. In addition to all of that work, she has written, edited, or contributed to 16 books, including 2 books about the writings of her paternal great-grandmother. Her latest book, Ida B. the Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells, is coming out in January by Atria One Signal Publishers, a division of Simon & Schuster. Congratulations, it's wonderful. And I've seen the beautiful cover on her Twitter feed, and so I encourage you to go to her Twitter feed and to order the new book through your favorite local bookstore. Michelle is also has 2 children's picture books that will be published in 2022, which follow her previous well-received children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream. I'll now turn it over to Michelle Duster.
Wow, thank you so much, Leslie, for that amazing introduction. And again, I echo Lori and thanking everybody who was involved in making this happen. And I'm so happy to be part of this amazing panel. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. I know I only have 5 minutes to talk about my great-grandmother. As you mentioned, she's my paternal great-grandmother. My father was Ida's grandson. So Ida had 4 children, and her youngest daughter, Alfreda, which some of your viewers might have met my grandmother Alfreda, was, like I said, Ida's youngest daughter. So that's how I'm related. So I'm going to briefly give an overview of who my great-grandmother was and what work she did regarding the fight for the right to vote. So really briefly, she was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. She was the first generation of formerly enslaved people to have the opportunity to become formally educated. So she attended, at the time it was called Shaw University, it's now Russ College. It's nothing like college today. I mean, this was like a one-room schoolhouse where everybody of all ages could become educated. So her mother actually went to school with her. she was the oldest of 8 children, and unfortunately was orphaned at the age of 16. And so she started her career as a teacher at the age of 16 in order to take care of her 5 surviving younger siblings. And she eventually moved to Memphis, where she was also teaching for a few years before she started getting into journalism. And I think she's most well known for the work that she did in journalism, although she did so many other things in her life. So she segued into journalism as kind of a side gig, where she was writing for newsletters within the churches. And then she eventually, one thing led to another, and she ended up ultimately being a co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech. And her life took a major turn to social activism when in 1892, 3 of her friends who were business owners of a grocery store were lynched. And so she realized at that point that lynching was not necessarily about the narrative that was being told at the time, that Black men were violating white women. She realized that lynching was being used as a tool to terrorize the Black community and to basically intimidate Black achievement. And so she started on what she considers, or people today consider, a crusade against justice, which was basically a truth-telling exercise where she documented the realities of what was going on regarding lynching and published them in newspaper articles and ultimately pamphlets. And then she started on a speaking tour, which took her overseas to the United Kingdom in 1893 and 1894. As Lori mentioned, that's where in 1894, where there was a clash between Ida B. Wells and Frances Willard. There was a meeting that took place, and it was really interesting because Ida, I think, realized that you have to fight truth. You have to fight false narratives with undisputable truths. And she actually mentioned in her autobiography that she carried a copy of the article that Frances Willard had the interview in. So then when people started questioning Ida about what was going on, she whipped out the article to show. So she used Frances Willard's exact words as proof. So, and I think she felt the need to do that. So it wasn't like, I think she said. She was like, it's almost today, like, retweeting something or doing a screen capture to show that this is what she really said. So ultimately, Ida settled in Chicago in 1895 when she got married to my great-grandfather, Ferdinand Barnett, who was an attorney and a newspaper owner. She started on her path towards more focused on sort of women's issues and voting rights for women. In 1896, she was a co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is what it's called today, which was focused on a myriad of different issues regarding focused on Black women. And we all know on this panel that part of the reason why Black women founded their own women's clubs was because they weren't really necessarily welcome within the white women's clubs. And some of the issues that were specific to Black women were not being addressed. So they founded their own clubs. She founded the Ida B. Wells Club in 1893 here in Chicago, and that's how she ended up being in the National Association of Colored Women clubs, because it was basically a coalition of clubs that had been around the country, so they decided to form into one national organization. In 1913, the state of Illinois passed restricted suffrage, which we can get into later. It was kind of weird, like they can vote in national and municipal votes, but not for statewide. And so Ida formed the Alpha Suffrage Club because she was already a member of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, and she had founded the Women's Second Ward Republican Club. But both of those clubs were not necessarily all Black or not all Black focused. And so she decided that she wanted to engage Black women specifically in this fight, in being included in the fight to vote. And that's how she ended up at the National Parade, and just a few months later in 1913, where she famously integrated the parade, which there was a request that Black women march in the back, and she was like, "You're not putting me in the back of anything." So she inserted herself into the front of the Illinois delegation, along in between two of her colleagues who had actually helped her found the Alpha Suffrage Club, and they were Belle Squire and Virginia Brooks. So I had worked with white women, and I think that's important for people to realize. It wasn't just so cut and dry, and there was no cross pollination or something. I mean, she did work, interracially. And then one of the first things that the Alpha Suffrage Club did was develop a block club system for registering voters, and they were very instrumental in getting Oscar DePriest voted in, elected as the first Black alderman in Chicago in the 2nd Ward. Today it's the 4th Ward. And then she also was involved in William Hale Thompson's campaign for mayor at the time. And then the last thing that my great-grandmother did when it comes to politics is she actually ran for state senate in 1930 as an independent, and she lost by a landslide. But the fact that she, as a Black woman, decided 10 years after the 19th Amendment was passed to actually become a candidate and run for office, in and of itself, I think was a win. And I know we're going to get into this later, but to me, Kamala Harris and all of the 117th Congress of women that were voted in, they're standing on shoulders. And so she's one of the people who blazed the trail for what we're celebrating today. So that's my summary.
Thanks so much, Michelle. It's always so inspiring to hear. Our final speaker today is Rima Lunin-Schultz. Dr. Schultz is an historian who has written numerous articles and books on Jane Addams, on Chicago women in the Catholic and Protestant faith traditions, and on the culture of urban elites. She is the co-editor of Women Building Chicago, 1790 to 1990, a biographical dictionary, which was named the best reference book in 2001 by the American Library Association. Not an easy award to win. She co-authored Eleanor Smith's Hull House songs, The Music of Protest and Hope in Jane Addams, Chicago, which appeared this year from Haymarket Press. She also wrote the introduction to the University of Illinois Press's reprint of the 1895 classic Hull House Maps and Papers. In addition to these print publications, Schultz is the author and director of the educational website Urban Experience in Chicago, Hull House and its Neighborhoods, 1889 to 1963, and she is an advisor to the online Jane Addams Papers Project at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Rima Schultz is currently working on a political and personal biography of Jane Addams and her partner, Mary Rose Smith. So I'm delighted to welcome Rima to our conversation.
Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I am happy to have had a very collegial and a very spirited, wonderful many months actually. Because of the COVID-19, we had to sort of rethink how we were going to do this. So I'm glad the night has come, finally. So I'm going to talk about Jane Addams. In June of 1934, and I want to put her in the context of race and move this whole thing to the 30s and then back again. So at that point, Jane Addams sent a congratulatory message to Walter White, who was then president of the NAACP. This is what she wrote him. I am proud to be a founder of the association, although I have contributed so little to its 25 years of courageous and beneficent activities. There is probably no greater social challenge in the present day world than that involved in race relations. Now that its dark confusion and moral obliquity has been acknowledged as worldwide, may we not openly confess the sins of our own beloved country and resolve to make restitution. Much has been written about Addams, who lived between 1860 and 1935, the daughter of a wealthy Illinois state senator who was an anti-slavery Republican and close ally of Abraham Lincoln. Addams' autobiographical work, 20 Years at Hull House, remains a foundational narrative in American history. She has been mythologized as an American heroine because she chose to help her immigrant neighbors, sharing life in a working class neighborhood in Chicago. She lived there for 45 years, and from that site became the most influential interpreter of immigrant life to the American public, and one of the country's first writers on urban life and culture. Her advocacy of labor unions and her role as a mediator in strikes, as a leader in the women's suffrage movement and in the international women's peace movement, may be known to many of you listening this evening. Maligned for her pacifism in World War I, she was a recipient in 1931 of the Nobel Prize for Peace. She was a keen intellect of the first generation of college-educated women, and she published 12 books. She published hundreds of magazine and journal articles as well. Addams played a central role in social feminist politics that empowered women in national affairs and advanced a modern social welfare agenda even before women voted. And she seconded the presidential nomination of Theodore Roosevelt on the Progressive Party ticket in 1912. At Hull House, her innovations led to the new fields of social work and sociology. Her writings identify her as a pragmatist philosopher alongside William James and John Dewey, who were friends, associates, and correspondents. And Dewey especially insisted that he had learned a great deal from Jane Addams and the programs that she had inaugurated at Hull House. At Hull House, interracialism, and that's an important word that we'll have to get to in our discussions. Interracialism could mean the NAACP's ingathering of whites and blacks, but it also meant cooperation, but not integration, as in the separate, all-Black Hull House Women's Community Club and the all-white Hull House Women's Club. When I found the photographs of the two groups, I had a visceral feeling about it and what had been attempted there and what had not been accomplished. And the word interracialism then became, as it has for Glenda Gilmore, a very different 19th century, late 19th century, turn of the century word that we have to be careful not to use in the way that we use it today. And it is different from segregation, and it is different from integration. So throughout her life, and this is my conclusion, she cooperated with Ida B. Wells and with W.E.B. Du Bois, and was public in her support of Blacks. Although, as one can tell by her telegram to Walter White, she was modest and self-critical about her race work. Addams chastises her generation and herself for not doing more for the cause of the, in quote, Negro or colored people. In her second 20 years at Hull House, which she published in 1930, Addams admits that her generation did not have the passion of the abolitionists, when it came to racism. What she had come to believe and what W.E.B. Du Bois had said to her, I'm sure on many occasions, was the greatest challenge facing her contemporaries and facing the world. A sentiment echoed in her telegram to the NAACP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rima, and thank each of you for really setting the table for us. It's not easy to summarize these incredible women and their lives, and you've really each done a great job. So I want to start with just an easy question, one that acknowledges that each of these women was an extraordinary leader in some way. Each stepped outside of what was expected of women during this time, and outside perhaps of their own comfort zones. And so I would like for each of you to just, one of the questions is a question about leadership. How do people become leaders? What happens when someone decides to step out in that way? And do you have a sense, each of you, for these women, what was the turning point for them in stepping into leadership and stepping into public, stepping outside of their comfort zone?
Can I begin?
Sure.
I've been thinking about this quite a bit since you, in a way, posed it in our general conversations that we've had. Addams, I believe, believed in the righteousness of her leadership, that she was part of the group in society that were the stewards, that were the cultured, that had the talent and had the opportunity and the privilege. And she never denied this. But she was a woman, so of course she couldn't be like her father. And of course she searched for ways to function. And initially, and almost like in a shocking way, she acted the leadership role. When she joined the Civic Federation as a new organization in Chicago right after the World's Fair in 1893. And she was on one of the committees, and it was at the moment of the Pullman strike in 1894. And they wanted to send her to negotiate with George Pullman. And she felt very comfortable going down to Pullman and attempting to get him to sit and talk to her. And then she wanted to get him to sit and talk to Eugene Debs. Well, she failed. But one of the impressive things about her was that she didn't think it was because she was unworthy of leadership at that point. And she went beyond that. She did other things of that nature. It was only after the defeat of the Progressive Party and Theodore Roosevelt, which had been a big compromise on her part, a big emotional negotiation, that she threw herself in because she thought she would be, that women would get suffrage and some other things that were on her agenda, even though there were many things about him that she really did not agree with. But they lost. And she traveled, she went away with Mary Rose Smith. They traveled for a while. And she came back, and at that point, she began to think a little bit differently about her role and the grassroots. And she wrote an incredible book that isn't very often read. It's called The Long Road of Women's Memory. And it was published in 1916. And in it, she has a lot of chapters, it's an eclectic book, but one of the things that she really concentrates on is the women in her neighborhood, the folk, the women who, by being who they were, by being the householders, by being the workers, by being the mothers whose daughters went into the union, the trade union, and came back, and they had to support them. The women who were doing the kinds of transformation of the social fabric at the ground level. And she began to realize how much they had wisdom and how much they had staying power and how much they were the leaders. And I think that the important thing about her concept of leadership actually was that it was in flux and that she was a different person at the end of her life in many ways than she was in the beginning. And that she became seasoned and much less sure that she knew really how to be the really right leader.
Very interesting. Thank you, Rima. Michelle, I'm curious, we would imagine that Ida B. Wells comes from the exact opposite of the kind of privilege that Rima talked about, that Jane Addams, in terms of stepping onto the stage. But every time I think about her, she just has this will. And what do you think was her, I think, well, anyway, you can say again what I think was her turning point to activism, but also this sense of herself as a leader. How do you think that she grew into that?
The first thing that comes to mind for me when it comes to her, I mean, as you said, sort of stepping out of her comfort zone and being sort of pushed into leadership, I personally think is when she lost her parents. I mean, she decided to step up. And obviously that's a very uncomfortable personal thing to experience, losing both of your parents at the same time, basically. So at the age of 16, she became a leader of her family. And she had to grow up very quickly. I mean, it's not like she had 5 younger siblings. And so she, you know, like I said, she decided to get a job as a teacher, and she took on all of the adult responsibilities that are involved in taking care of, you know, a number of other people in addition to herself. And then if you talk about from a public space of becoming a leader, I think the turning point obviously was when she lost her friends to lynching. Before that, she was involved. I mean, she had sued the railroad in 1884, so that was 8 years before her friends were killed. But I don't think that was her considering herself a leader. It was just more her, you know, standing up for herself. But I think that when her friends were killed, this is just my personal opinion, and that was such a personal loss. And it was such an affront to what she grew up with as ideas of freedom, because it's very important to remember that she grew up during Reconstruction. She came of age during Reconstruction when there was a lot of progress, and then she experienced a huge backlash. And so I think it's one thing to grow up without having something and not knowing what it's like, and it's a different thing to grow up with something and have it taken away. And so, you know, to have all of these rights you know, taken away, and she was just indignant, like, wait a minute, you know, today I can do this and tomorrow I can't. And so she, you know, just decided to fight for what she believed she deserved as a citizen of this country. From what I understand, and I can only go by, you know, obviously there are a lot of historical documents, but then she has her own story. Luckily, she wrote an autobiography, so she has her own perspective. And from her autobiography, she made it clear that she felt that she had the right to everything that this country promised, you know, all citizens. And when that wasn't something that she experienced, she felt she had the right to have a voice, to speak up for herself. So she was absolutely pushed. I think if her friends had not been killed, she was very content being a journalist. She made it very clear that she was enjoying, you know, growing the newspaper. She enjoyed writing. She enjoyed, you know, just kind of documenting what was going on in her community. But I think that a horrible incident just pushed her into a leadership position. And I think that happens, you know, with a lot of people. That it's not like they wake up one day and have that as a goal on their vision board. There's just something happens, and they make the decision to step into that role. And I think that's what happened with her.
Great, thank you. Lori?
It strikes me that all 3 of these women wrote their autobiographies and told their own stories and left us their both a narrative to follow that of their lives, but also a little glimpse of how they could use their biographies to further their causes. Because Willard's definitely in that group. She wrote an autobiography when she turned 50 called Glimpses of 50 Years. And she tells the story, and there are sort of suffrage related stories. So they're kind of well connected to what we're talking about. And she starts with, because suffrage in her lifetime is such a radical thing for someone of her stature to propose. And it was always controversial. So she makes sure to include a story about her sort of coming to understanding about why women should have the right to vote in her autobiography. She starts with the story of seeing her father and her brother go off to vote. And she says, as she tells it in Glimpses, to her younger sister, Mary, she says to Mary, "Don't we love our country as much as they do?" And Mary says, the story goes, "Yes, but we can't say that we'll be considered strong-minded." And this little story kind of strikes me because she's pretty young when this happens, when she recognizes that she's not going to grow up and get to go vote like her older brother Oliver. And the contrast between her brother Oliver and herself is always something she's monitoring in her young life. So it kind of starts early, like you're saying, Michelle, a moment of realization where the difference and the sense of being excluded, being left out, strikes Willard at a young age. She takes that with her and works on suffrage, sort of women's rights, the woman question, as it was called in her time, and kind of muddles over it through the years as she's growing up. But in the 1860s, as the women's rights movement is really starting, the suffrage movement is starting to really take off, especially following the war, Willard starts to really become much more engaged and certain that she should work on the woman question. And then when she joins the WCTU in 1874 is when it's founded, she becomes the president in 1879. This sort of galvanizing women around a cause, the WCTU doesn't support, the membership doesn't support suffrage to begin with. It's not until Willard joins the organization or becomes the president that she really pushes the WCTU with her understanding around women's rights and the need for suffrage. And someone in the WCTU, I can't remember if it was the first president who she took over from and beat in an election. But someone says to her, when she starts talking suffrage, you've just sealed the deal. You're going to fail. No one's going to follow you when you take on such a radical point of view. And Willard basically says, "I'm sorry, but this is where I stand." And I'm paraphrasing the story, but there's these moments around this sense of that she should be treated equally and fairly, and that she doesn't understand why. It starts when she's young. She feels it very personally, but then what she does, and this is something maybe Wells and Addams, they all have in common, is she doesn't stop with feeling something personally. She sort of says, okay, I feel this, and so does this person, and so does this person, and so does this person. And not only do we all collectively feel this, but we need to work to change it. And I'm going to work not just to change it for myself, but for all these people I can see around me who are also affected by this inequality and this lack of respect and understanding of your humanity, really. So that process is really the process I think of that she follows, of becoming a leader, finding her voice. She sort of has it when she's young, but it's not trained on anything specific until this particular, she sees the potential of this organization and this work in the WCTU.
Well, Lori, you've opened the door to the question of suffrage, and I really appreciate how you said how radical it is. And I think for me, even as a historian, this year, again, with the commemoration, the PBS documentary, which maybe many of you have seen, many in the audience have seen, which really emphasized how radical it was for women to vote. That I knew it, but there's some, the story that you're telling of Willard, looking at her male family members and her sister saying no, and the other women in the WCTU saying no, that the vote was something that when women took it on, even among women, it wasn't an automatic yes. And so these women in their support of suffrage, Wells, Willard, and Addams, are also stepping out of some expectations. I think of the three, probably, Michelle, for Ida B. Wells, first because we for so long knew less about her for all of the reasons that are true for Black women in history, but also the recovery of Ida B. Wells has been so much around the anti-lynching activism. I think there's less known about her dedication to suffrage. And could you talk a little bit about how that, when she started the Alpha Club for Black women, was that automatically something that Black women embraced? I mean, Lori has described white women as not universally being in favor of suffrage. Was this something that Wells felt that she had to do among Black women, sort of education around suffrage, as well as the sort of political organizing to fight for the vote?
Well, I can only go by what she wrote, and so based on what she wrote in her autobiography, she talked about how it wasn't just educating women; it was also educating men. Because I mean, she went, I guess, door to door, literally, to register women to vote. And a lot of the women were married to men who had this problem with women wearing the pants and that kind of thing. And so she had to educate them, or just sort of do a sales pitch or whatever, to like help people understand that if you have women voting, then that doubles the number of people that can vote. And so she positioned her argument of, we as a community, because this is for the second ward that she was canvassing for an alderman, Oscar Dupree. So it was about, we as a people, Black people who are living in the Black Belt, it was a predominantly Black community at that time, and still is. So she kind of sold the idea that of self-determination, that we as a people can pool our resources together and create a political block of power. And in order to do that, we need women to also register to vote. So we have the numbers in this ward in order to take this over the top. And so she talks about how she had to talk to the men, the husbands of these women, to convince them to allow their wives, and I hate the word allow, but that's pretty much what it was, to buy into, or to agree to this as a strategy from a, like I said, a self-determination standpoint, so that there could be representation of, if you want to call it, Black issues or issues that affected Black people, represented in City Hall. And so that's what she did. And so she, I mean, I'm not sure how many people she originally founded the Suffrage Club with, but I know that eventually there were around 200 members. So, I'm not sure exactly how many people she had with her, what posse she had with her to go around, canvassing to encourage more and more women to actually register to vote. But that was the strategy, and that was the argument that I understand that she was dealing with.
it seems really similar as you're talking, Michelle. I'm thinking of Frances Willard working on persuading women in the 1880s using something she called the home protection ballot, where women don't need to vote on everything. They're just going to vote on the things that affect women's lives, the school board, and whether or not there's a saloon in your town, and sort of that. Like, she's not just persuading the women, which she was, but also the men in their lives that, that it's okay. Your wife can vote. She's going to vote on things that are just about the family. And
Exactly.
so that, that similar kind of work, need for persuasion, and also kind of the whole idea of if we vote as a block, we're going to be able to make change that we need. And so we need those women voting too. Of course, both of them are like, of the mind that women deserve the right to vote because they deserve the right to vote. But sometimes that's not the argument that's going to persuade.
Yeah, I mean, because you're making transformational change in a society. So that is very intimidating for some people. So you have to kind of meet them where they are. In order to get them on board. So it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Rima, what is Jane Addams' position on these issues? I'm thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and some of the earlier activists were very wanted to vote for white women, but were very racist in not wanting to vote for new immigrant populations or for African Americans. Where does Addams fit into these discussions and debates about suffrage for women and race issues, considering she's in this immigrant community working?
Addams actually held up a vote for charter reform in Chicago because it didn't include the vote for all women. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was being debated among white men who were voting in the city was whether or not immigrants should get more power. And one of the problems was that this was an immigrant city. I mean, 3 out of 4 people were either in Chicago in the 1890s, were either in 1900, were either born in another country or were the children of people who had come here from another country. So the degree to which we had newcomers and recently assimilated Americans voting in the city wards was very great. And Addams was easily one of the most ardent champions of democracy for immigrants. She did not use the language of alien, of people, even this notion that people could not have rights because they were alien was alien to her. Her notion was that the best thing that Americans could do to ensure that democracy would prosper was to be democratic, small d. And that entailed giving rights to all the people who are living in the country. And she really believed that it was important for all women to vote. And she was involved with the ethnic groups in the city of women who had organized in their own areas, but were interested in the vote. And so this was a great movement. And she was, of course, interested in Black people voting. There was no question. In fact, around the time of 1913, that the sort of strange vote in Illinois, the vote in everything that is not named in the state Constitution of Illinois, any office that isn't named, women could vote for. Any office that was named, they could, because it was a provision that only males could vote in Illinois. So that was the reason. So they had a kind of a funny amount of voting that they could do, but that was very important for Illinois, and as a spearhead for the larger national vote getting, that was important. And Addams was clearly in the midst of all of this, but she sees the cosmopolitan and democratic, small d, possibilities of democracy in urban areas in a very positive way. And it's critical, she believes, that cities, municipalities encourage and use the talents of all their citizenry. And that means women voting. So she's not even making an argument necessarily from rights, though I think that that's implicit, of course, in everyone, but in this notion that the industrial society requires a kind of social citizenship and a government that takes on social or welfare type of functions. And who knows better than this than women? And who knows better than this than women who have come here as immigrants and are challenged, and race women who are deeply engaged in community building. So she's very ardent, and what she does is write for the popular press in ways that are very important. In those days, without television and without radio, the idea of that people read all the time, and they read things like the Ladies' Home Journal, for example, which we see in the supermarket or things like that, were actually much more serious. And she had a column about women, and she wrote about women and why women should get the vote. And she was very, she disseminated these ideas, naturalized these ideas, attempted to naturalize the concept for women as much as for men, that women had a natural, an organic role in the progress of the human race, and that required voting. So yes, and she was very good on that issue, no question. That was one of her strongest and most clear approaches to democracy and advocacy of women's rights.
I want to ask a question of the three of you about Chicago and Illinois as a space for women's activism that's perhaps a little unique. Is there something, I'm a newcomer, so I've only been here a few years. Do you think there's something unique about this state or the city that made for greater possibilities for women's activism, and particularly around suffrage and political activism? Or did the women that you study say anything unique about?
Frances Willard likes to talk about Evanston as a paradise for women. That's a great quote of hers, but I think by extension, she does mean the broader world of Chicago. And Rima can probably tell you, but I wanted to clarify something about this 1913 vote. There's two moments in Illinois suffrage history that are really critical. One of them, and all three of the women who we're talking about, Frances Willard didn't live to see the 1913 vote, but in 1892, Illinois women are voting for school board, school elections. So there are two moments where they get partial ballots, that home protection idea, or a partial ballot, is a really big thing in Illinois. It isn't as big in other places, but Illinois really runs with it. So one of them happens in the 1890s. In 1892, Illinois women are given the right to vote in school elections. Wells is really active on getting African-American representation on the University of Illinois School Board, or Illinois Board of Trustees. And those are the first elections where women can also run for office. So that's a really important little moment. it is a funny vote in 1913 where women are given the vote on all elections not prohibited by the Illinois Constitution. And that includes voting for president, voting for presidential electors. So Illinois women are voting for president in 1916, the next presidential election, and they influence the election. And there's lots of campaigning in Illinois of both parties coming here trying to get, because Illinois women there are more Illinois women than in any other state voting for president. All of the other Western states don't have enough population to really influence the election, but there are enough women in Illinois that it's really critical. And I don't think it's an accident that it's just 3 years later. So even though it's kind of that we have the 19th Amendment and New York gives women the right to vote in 1917. So that 1913 vote, though kind of a funny, that the partial ballot works in Illinois, it works as a wedge strategy and kind of opens the door. So I'll let others talk about Chicago and this environment and the Illinois as a place for women's leadership. I think it's clear that it is a place where women are thriving and working and are participating on all sorts of levels, especially in this 1890 to 1920, this time period, this critical time. But those two votes, really, really important moments for suffrage history in the state.
I think that Wanda Hendricks and Maureen Flanagan, who both have written about Chicago and Midwest women in the progressive era, have made the argument that there's something about the region that we have to look at, that something happens here. The equation of the way the population comes together, the proportions of people, the lack of an 18th and 17th century structure of aristocracy or landed gentry or traditional patriarchal boundaries and whatnot may be one of the things that we see here. The fact that all of the institutions, universities, seminaries, and so on, that are educating women are not, unlike the East Coast, they're not well known. I mean, Rockford College, it's called Rockford Female Seminary when Addams goes, and in Rockford, Illinois, is not well known. And in fact, you know, there's this kind of a little story about maybe she didn't really want to go there, but her father was a trustee, so she goes there. But anyway, the fact that this is a place of newness is very important. But it's also a place that always has Catholic, Jewish, non-Protestant ethnic groups on the ground, building community, pretty much with Protestants. So sure, Evanston, Oak Park, certain parts of the city of Chicago itself are known for the Protestant establishment that's here. But early on, in the time of the growth of the Chicago public schools, to give you a good example, the teachers are by 1910, 1912, when Ella Flagg Young, who was the first female to run a very big city public school system, is upset because there are too many Catholic girls who've been trained in Catholic parochial institutions and high schools going to the normal college for teaching and teaching in the public schools. The Board of Education has Catholics on it. So the Protestant establishment isn't here. That means that there are things open for what German socialists, for example, have to say, or uh, liberal Jews like Emil G. Hirsch, who worked with Ida B. Wells and opened up the Sinai Temple to the Black community on many occasions. And the NAACP used to have one of its events when it would have its annual conference in Chicago here. There was a mix in a way that was different from other parts of the country. And the other interesting thing that really, I think, made Addams' career was the fact that there was a really good women's political culture already in place when she arrived in 1889. In fact, one of the first things that she and Ellen Gates Starr, her college friend, who they were the co-founders together of Hull House, the very first thing they do, even before they open up Hull House, is they join the Chicago Women's Club. And there is some confusion in the newspapers. A number of the newspapers think that Hull House is actually a project of the Chicago Women's Club, and in the way it is. And the degree to which the movement across class and race occurs in Chicago, and to the extent that people like Ida B. Wells are engaged in campaigns to get white females elected to the Board of Regents of the University of Illinois, which is Lucy Flower. Coos Flower is the person that Ida B. Wells is campaigning for. The fact that this is happening is just an indication of the fluidity and the lack of rigid boundaries. And that's why I think the 1919 race riot is so horrible.
I'm gonna get to that race riot. Michelle, how does Ida B. Wells talk about these possibilities in Chicago? Are these a feature of her discussion in her autobiography? Does Chicago feature as this kind of open opportunity?
Doesn't really say something like that so explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, one thing this is just my own personal opinion. I think, I can't speak to the whole state of Illinois, but I think Chicago, when it comes to activism and sort of this, dynamic exchange of ideas, I can't help but think that when it comes to Black people specifically, the migration, the Great Migration that took place, the first wave right after World War I, and then the other one after Ida passed away during World War II. But the massive, level of migration that took place is part of what, ultimately led to the 1919 riots and a lot of the riots that took place in the North, because there was such an influx of people from the South that were relocating to the North, and then because of all of the housing restrictions, there was this overcrowding situation, and then tension when it came to employment and overcrowding when it came to schools and on and on. So that's a bad mix where you have too many people in too small a space that are competing for the same resources. But I just think that when it comes to organizing in Chicago specifically, and specifically among African Americans, you have to think about the personality of people who are willing to migrate. Usually they have maybe a little bit more resources, and they might have more skills, maybe, or at least more ambition, or whatever is internal to that person to decide, I'm going to leave everything that I know to go to a place that I'm unfamiliar with and start a whole new life. And Chicago is full of people like that, so there's something about that spirit that is involved in that type of personality that I think probably is a part of what makes Chicago different, than maybe some of the other cities, especially on the East Coast, that there wasn't, they definitely had the migration during, the Great Migration, but it was a little bit still more the Midwest, St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City. I mean, it was almost like directly south. And then of course on the East Coast, you have a little bit more of that in like Washington, DC or Maryland area, but not necessarily the same. It's just a different dynamic, I think. So that's just my theory, unsubstantiated. I've not studied this, but that's just my guess.
And all three of them come to Chicago. None of them are natives. All three of them come here and start something new. So it's interesting actually to think of them that way, Michelle.
I did want to mention, Rima brought up the 1919 race riots, which, last year we had many commemoration of that horrible event. And this year we're talking, of course, about suffrage, but do you have any sense of how the race riot affected discussions around women's suffrage? Did it, and particularly for Wells and Addams, did it change their activism in any way?
It's funny, autobiographies, because, people make decisions, I guess, on what they choose to write about and what they don't, and maybe what they personally consider to be important or not. I don't know. One thing when we started, this is off topic, but when we just got on this like COVID-19 virus, and then I realized that we had the 1918, epidemic. I looked in Ida's autobiography to see how did she handle, the 1918 epidemic, and she didn't even mention it at all. So, and she barely mentioned. It's like maybe two paragraphs where she mentioned the 1919 riot. So I don't know if it was like, okay, well, that's just one other problem to deal with or not, but she really did not go into detail. So I could only guess, that it might have had an impact or not, but maybe not. Maybe it was just one other thing to deal with that wasn't maybe in her mind a big deal, big enough to write any extensively in any extensive way about it.
Where was she living at the time, Michelle? Is she living? I'm just curious what house.
In 1919, she was living at 3624 South King Drive.
Yeah. Okay.
And she talked about briefly, after the riot took place, then she went out. She was the only one out of her family that went out in the streets and was like talking to people and investigating and see what's going on. And so that's pretty interesting that her husband and her children were like, you go do that. You go. But she does talk about how she had written a letter, I guess, to the mayor at the time, encouraging there to be some kind of preventative action on the part of the city, because she, according to her, in her autobiography, she could see that the tension was rising, and it was like, there's something going to happen if we don't address this problem of racial inequity, racial tension. And I think maybe today in 2020 we can maybe kind of relate to that. You can kind of feel it in the air and see that things are sort of escalating. And so according to her, she could see the escalation. It was like, we need to nip this in the bud before it boils over. So she sort of predicted that there would be some kind of, tipping point would happen. As far as how that impacted her individual activism, I really don't know based on what she wrote, because she didn't really connect the two. It was more like, whoa, here's another thing that's happening. And we have to remember, she wrote about the riot that took place in East St. Louis in 1917. There was a riot in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, which was the impetus for the founding of the NAACP. So, I mean, she could see there was a pattern, of this sort of influx of African Americans from the South that were competing for jobs. This is also the convergence of the World War I and you having, returning veterans who were not about to take any stock because they had just fought for democracy, freedom and democracy overseas. And so for them to come back here and be treated like second-class citizens, they weren't putting up with that. So there was just a lot of different, think about it, there was a pandemic in 1918, and when you're dealing with World War I, you're dealing with, overcrowding situations. I mean, there was just a lot of things. It was like a powder, what do you call it, a powder keg of just sort of social issues that all kind of converged in 1919.
But what you're saying is that this was a continuum for her, that she, this was not, in some ways, unfortunately, not out of the ordinary for the time. It's kind of attention.
Well, no, I mean, she had seen, like I said, and she wrote a whole pamphlet about the East St. Louis riot, which took place in 1917. And then, like I said, in Springfield, Illinois, in 1908, there was a riot. So there was riot after riot. I mean, it was just kind of like escalating. And then in 1919, and it spread across the whole country. And that one summer, like 25 different cities. And in one summer, there were, riots. So it wasn't a surprise. I think it wasn't a surprise to her, and I'm sure there were a whole lot of other people who were not surprised, because I really think there's a little bit of a correlation between 1919 and 2020. I mean, we could see, those of us who have seen what's going on in our country in just a few months ago, I don't think it was super shocking, because it has been sort of building over these past few years of Black Lives Matter and, police shootings and police brutality. I mean, it's not a shock that people are just tired.
Addams had become a public pacifist in ways which were shocking to people. During World War I, when we entered the war, she continued to be a pacifist. She had been an anti-imperialist and had been involved in peace movements from the 1898 and the Spanish-American War and so forth in Cuba. And she continued on this route. And she suffered for it. She was. The Chicago Tribune basically accused her of being un-American, and this was the beginning of her long battle, really, with the American government, and the eventual surveillance of her by the FBI, and the fact that she had a pretty thick file, as you can see in the Hull House Museum. But so she herself had what we would call a fall from grace. She had been a very popular and a very well-respected woman, and what she said was often, accepted as kind of, a good thing. And all of a sudden, people turned against her. At the same time that the increase in violence in the neighborhoods in Chicago, because of the very pressures that Michelle has so well identified, the fact that housing and the shortages of housing for Black people was so immensely significant, and the dual market and the way in which the boundaries of the Black Belt were created and sustained at this time against all efforts of African Americans with money to get out. It didn't even matter if you bankers and upper middle class Black people who bought homes and so forth had their homes bombed as well. And so Addams was accused of anti-Americanism, unpatriotism, and she was really written badly about. And she wrote a retort to the Chicago Tribune, and she linked the housing problem, the race problem, the violent problem, the violence all together. And she accused the police state at that point for essentially not being the protector of the American people, but being, in fact, the perpetrator of crime. And she accused the attorney general or the state's attorney of ignoring the fact that in 8 months' time, 20 bombings of Black people's homes had occurred and had been reported, and no one had been arrested and so forth. At the same time that terrible raids in the immigrant neighborhoods and deportation of people who were not yet naturalized citizens were occurring. And it reminds me so very, very much of what we have been going through the last 4 years, where we have been angry about our borders, some of us, worried about what is American and what is not American, and being very, very really avoiding the responsibility of democracy, which Addams felt was the great relationship that people had to the democracy, that the social responsibility we had to one another, the social contract. She saw the war and all of the things that were emerging as a result of the war and the violence that was occurring as really destroying the fabric, the social fabric that she had really worked so very, very hard to shore up and to expand and make better. So she was very affected by this, and realized that the housing problem was really a race problem. And that was one of the first times that she established that in a public situation, writing to the newspaper. And she was also, again, mostly in Europe at this time, because this was the year that she began the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So she was at The Hague, she was traveling in Europe, and she was also working to again, another thing that people lambasted her for. She had the nerve to worry about the starving German children after World War I. And she perceived this as being the beginnings of World War II, that there wasn't any effort to deal with the aftermath of the war in the right way, and so forth. So yeah, this was all coming together. But she too realized that race was the confounding issue in many of these things, though she did not have a very good strategy for getting to the next resolution of the problem.
I want to, on that note, open us up to questions. But as we move to questions, I want to invite people to begin to draw the connections that we've already begun, which are, we're looking at 100 years back, but we are in our own moment, a moment of pandemic, a moment of critique, of course, ongoing, long-term. We're hearing a critique of police brutality, of these same issues of housing, of racism, of class, that these were issues of suffrage itself, of what is the utility of the vote. The radicalism 100 years ago of having women vote, not to mention non-whites, new immigrants. We have the same conversations today. And so I want to make sure we have time to get questions from the audience, but also to welcome questions that invite us to make some of those connections. What are the lessons we should take from that time to this, from the activism of these women, the things they did right and the things they did wrong? So to help us with the questions, I want to introduce our colleague Ross Jordan of Jane Addams Hull House Museum. He is a curator interested in the confluence of politics, history, and visual culture. He's the curatorial manager at James Addams Hull House Museum, where he supports the production of exhibitions and programs that connect the social justice issues of the past to the present via collaborations with artists and community-based organizations. So I'm going to ask him to read the questions and monitor the questions and pass them on to us. So thanks, Ross.
Thank you all for joining us and I'm just happy to be here. This has been a great discussion. I've enjoyed listening along, and I would be remiss without kind of elevating the former chief curator and director of Jane Addams Hull House Museum, Jennifer Scott, who was the third partner in terms of bringing us all together, bringing the three institutions together. So I do want to lift up her this evening. We have tons of questions, but to your point about making connections between these three women, Brett McMillan asks, and I'm going to read this a little bit. He says, "Thank you for this great discussion," but they're asking, how do we sort out presentist critiques from Addams, about Addams, from critiques of her race work in its time at the moment? So this is kind of the question of how do we evaluate the past as well. And the other part I think about this is, and someone else asked this as well, second part of this question is how does Ida B. Wells evaluate us now? How does Jane Addams evaluate us now? So I feel like this question is always about, well, can we really evaluate race in the past? Like, it's so different. How can we understand it? But I think that question also goes to us into the future. And so I'm hoping, I don't know, you could tackle that. Maybe Leslie, if you want to rephrase that even better.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. This is a classic question on all sorts of issues. Can we as historians look to the past and say, wow, they didn't do such a good job? Or should we just say, these are, as the classic phrase, these are just people of their time, they didn't know any better. And we could ask it of Addams, of course, we could, Willard, certainly, we could ask it of, but I think, Ida B. Wells herself and the critiques she had, but anyway, I'll turn it over to the panelists. How do you, in your writing and thinking about these historical?
One of the things that we did with the Truth Telling Project is we really, really emphasized the records. We went back and said, okay, there's been lots of conversation about what happened with this conflict between Wells and Willard, and not a lot, but enough that there had been some ground laid. And we realized that we didn't really know what happened. We didn't know it in the time, how it evolved, because it took about 2 years for the whole thing to really happen. And so we went back, we unfortunately, we have a wonderful archive we have a scrapbook full of the newspaper clippings. This happened in the internet, the online world of the time, when the newspapers and flurry of opinion columns and letters back and forth and all sorts of things. It was very public conflict. So we felt like with truth telling, we needed to let the documents speak for themselves. The words, like as you said, Michelle, just let the words carry that newspaper article around with you, and no one can dispute this is what they said. And so in the project, we really tried to just let the archives speak and people make up their minds. Of course, we can't be totally neutral in our that's not a goal we can really aspire to completely, but we wanted the past to speak on its own, let them speak for themselves a little bit. And then we can draw our own conclusions. I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's, we're lucky that we have records to rely on. That isn't always the case in every situation.
I think that the whole question of race is, evolves in time by both Black and white witnesses. What they define as being the goal. And I remember hearing Stokely Carmichael in the 60s at a meeting saying, and it really shocked me, but it made me think a lot. And he said, you know, white people talk about integration. That's their thing. What they're saying is, you know, it's only good if it's white and Black people come and do it. You know, Black people come and live in a white neighborhood. Black people come and go to a white school. He said, well, I don't think that that's what integration should be about. And it was his evaluation of a word and a goal that was very pertinent to us in the 60s. And so when I think about how we, as historians, work on these things, we have to take into consideration language and how language changes, which is why I talked about interracialism being thought about differently by Addams and Willard and even Wells. And I looked again at Crusade for Justice, the autobiography of Wells, you know, she treats Addams pretty well. But what she says about Addams, she doesn't say, I think she's the greatest woman in America. She says, considered the greatest woman in America. You know, that's what the popular culture is saying about her. And there are these small little things. And then she said, when they were working on the issue of whether the public schools should be segregated or not in Chicago, which was rumored to be something that people wanted to do. And Ida B. Wells, it's Ida B. Wells, if you tell the story correctly, she calls Addams and she says to Addams, these articles are in the Tribune and they are encouraging segregation in the schools. What can you do? What can we do about it? How can you help me? I want you to have a meeting. And so the initiative is not from Addams, it's from Wells. That's a very important part of that story. That gets us to, you know, sort of the bottom of it. And then Wells says, you know, Addams called these well-to-do elite civic and financial leaders to Hull House. And I came and I told them the story. And then Addams made this committee and she was the chair. And Wells didn't want to be on that committee. She wanted it to be Addams' committee and Addams should go. And as Wells says, do those things that she can do, that white people can do for us that we cannot do for ourselves right now. That's a very important discussion of motivation, agency, initiative. And that's what we have to do, a close reading of the record. And that's very important.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to quickly add, I mean, if we're still talking about Ida B. Wells, who did leave a record for us to read today. So she was there during that time and she was writing about what was happening during her time from her own perspective. And so for her to be critical of certain people at that time, I think speaks to the idea that people made choices of how they wanted to address or not address certain issues. Because if Ida felt that they didn't have any choice but to be racist or to uphold racist attitudes or policies, then she probably would not have been critical of them because she would have felt, well, they don't have, there's nothing else they can do. But for her to decide they didn't do enough, they didn't do as much as they could have, to me speaks to the fact that they made a choice. And they were not products of their environment or products of their time, meaning that they had no other choice but to do nothing. She felt that they did have a choice and they chose to not do anything. And I think she made that criticism based on the fact that there were people who were actual allies who did make choices to fight for equality and justice. And actually, she found quite a few allies in other countries, specifically England. But there were other, people in the Northeast. And so she had, in real time in her life, people to compare her analysis to. And she was specific in who she was critical about.
Yeah, I have always been struck by her criticism of Willard really coming from a place of where Willard's leading an organization where there are Black women who are members, who are leaders, who are, at these meetings with her, and yet she is not speaking out on an issue where their very lives and the lives of their families are threatened. And I feel like for Wells, it's so crystal clear that this is not a tenable position for Willard to take. Meanwhile, she's sort of in the St. Francis mode of admiration and veneration that she's receiving, and the just the contradiction. Well, it's just kind of clear, and you can see she can't let it not be spoken, so I agree with you, Michelle. Willard had every reason to be much more understanding and much more vocal about this, and she did not choose to be that. And then she has to change her mind, which she does, but with pressure. So.
And I mean, I think that Ida felt extremely betrayed and extraordinarily disappointed with Frances Willard because she had such a broad reach. In today's world, that would be like somebody having 18 million Twitter followers, and you ask them to send out a message because they have such a broader reach, because there were like 200,000 members, I think, of the WCTU, right? And so Frances Willard had a huge platform, and Ida asked her if she could use her platform to, get this message out, and she didn't do it. And I mean, there was a big age difference between the two of them, and so I think Ida went to her with this idea that she could have an allyship and have somebody to help her get this message out, and she didn't do it. And so I think that was just sort of devastating to Ida. And I equate it to, if we want to try to bring it to 2020, I don't know how everybody's political views are, but what's going on right now in our country, there are people who have the ability to speak out about what's going on, and they're choosing not to. And so 100 years in the future, when people say, well, they were just a product of their time. No, they're not. They are making choices right now in 2020 to take a stand or not take a stand, and they do have a choice. And I think it's the same thing 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm also thinking about the political structures that a person like Addams was trying to influence. For example, she, during the 1912 political convention that nominated a third-party ticket, the Progressive Party, and nominated Theodore Roosevelt for president. One of the things that happened was that there were many delegates, Black delegates from the South, and they were not seated. And the question was what to do about this. And there were lots of reasons why the Republicans, who had split over the failed Reconstruction of the South, which was still, and is to this day, still part of the political landscape of the South, where white supremacy, in quote, trumps everything else. This was an issue, and Addams wrote a minority plank with a group of cohort of Black leadership who had met at Hull House and so forth, and they lost. And it was covered by the New York Times, and others and so forth. And she had a decision to make. Should she continue to support Theodore Roosevelt, or should she go home, or should she support Woodrow Wilson, who it ended up was even worse for the Blacks? But she didn't know that was going to be, that he was going to take away the last vestige of federal integration in the civil service bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. But anyway, she had to make a choice. And the choice she made was to gamble that if Theodore Roosevelt won in 1912, he said that he would be interested in a national amendment to give women the vote. And I think, and there were some other social welfare type of platform agendas that she thought could be carried. And she thought that a national campaign on this agenda would be an incredible education for the whole country. And so she decided to do that. And the mail that she got afterwards showed how complicated that decision was. There were people on all sides of that issue, African-American leaders and white leaders who were angry with her, who were happy with her, and so on. But she had decided to be a political influence, even without voting. And to do that, she had to keep her avenues of influence open. So I think that many times she made strategic decisions. And when we look back at them as historians, well, first of all, we have to know what was the strategy that she was worried about? What was the context for it? Susan B. Anthony made strategic decisions. Frances Willard did, and so did Addams. What's interesting is how Ida Wells seemed to accept what Susan B. Anthony ended up doing. She retained a relationship and even a somewhat of a friendship with this older woman that she did not have with Willard, and she really never developed with Addams any kind of a close friendship. I mean, that was part of it. But the fact is that Ida B. Wells herself was a real politician. She was adroit. Her power came from the fact that she dealt with both Republicans and Democrats in the Second Ward in Chicago. And she really was a dealer, a player. And she needed to do that. So we have to decide, how much do we want to critique that? How much do we want to accept it as being part of the way that our system works? But it certainly has to be part of the narrative that we bring forward when we discuss this as historians.
Right. Well, I mean, I just want to make one last point. I mean, my perspective then, and what was going on with these three women we're talking about, and even today, is that I just want to be clear that there's always a choice. And so I don't think that the argument of they're a product of their time, implying that there was no choice.
Oh, no,
I think it needs to, I mean, I'm just saying, not that any of us said this, but I've heard it before. Well, sort of gloss it over and say, well, they were a product of their time. Yes, they were, but there were other people living in the same time who made different choices. So for whatever reason, they evaluated all of their choices and they made a decision on which direction they were going to go in. And so, yes, they were a product of their time, but they were also a product of their own decision-making.
Thank you for that. I love this. This is it's a really stimulating way to think about the past. The other another question that's kind of related to this, and there's a bunch of questions like this that are kind of trying to figure out, well, what is useful about the past that we can bring to the present moment, right? Immediately. So this is a question from Facebook, from Rosemary Walters. What arguments can we use today to get more equal treatment for women and people of color? And this is kind of, I guess, mirrored with another question, someone asking about the evaluation of women who were, anti-suffrage during the suffrage movement, women who were anti-ERA during the ERA movement. Of course, we're celebrating anniversary of that as well. And what arguments do we use to kind of bring more justice to the table? when the fights have been happening for so long and there's been a constant kind of new barriers, new challenges put up. And of course, this is certainly for people of color in this country, but for women as well. And I think people are looking for women's leadership now. And we're in a moment, as my mother put it last night, she was like, they can't say anything now because we have a Black woman vice president. And we already had a Black president 4 years ago. So we're covered. But to the question of what does the past do to kind of our current moment? How do we think through it?
You know, I just want to say something really quickly, which is not by no means a solution, but the way I think about the past is it was just as screwed up and crazy then as it is now. And I think that that's a good thing to know, because I think sometimes people romanticize the past and sort of simplify it and make it seem like, I mean, especially when it comes to African Americans, I've heard this so many times, like, oh, why can't we be more today that like we were in the past? We were so cohesive and we had all of this, you know, whatever. And I'm like, no, we didn't. It was just as crazy and screwed up and dysfunctional back in the day as it is today. There was never a cohesive, you know, 100% collaboration on everything. There was never, I mean, you know, like there's a whole nother discussion between like Ida B. Wells and Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. I mean, there was never, you know, this one solid kind of strategy and attitudes about how to solve problems. I mean, there might not even have been agreement on what the problems were. And so I think that's just my answer, is that when people talk about the past and how it relates to current, just the idea that what we're dealing with now, being dysfunctional, is no different and no less complex than, or no more complex than it was before. People have always been kind of divided and screwed up and kind of screwed up.
And I would want to go back to our beginning when I asked about
Sorry.
leadership and the turning point. And each of you, also in your presentations of these women, talked about they're not perfect. They're not only to be on a pedestal. I think in discussing the successes and failures, the places where they made mistakes, where they wish they had done things differently, to really understand that that is the nature of leadership as well. I think Laura, you said she's human. She's not the, you know, Frances Willard was not the saint, the angel on the pedestal, but
Yeah, I've been thinking this year we should get rid of all the pedestals. We don't really need them. They don't help us. They don't, you know, present us with a useful view of the past. So, and one of the things I think about the challenge of talking about the past is that we need to understand that for these women, they're working on making change, and they have different strategies. They're very strategic. They're all very political, very, very aware of the compromises and the choices and the difficult nature of change and how hard it is to get people to come with you. Willard spends a lot of time thinking about, how do I get everyone on this wagon and how do I keep them all? One of her big compromises, the reason she's compromising and not coming out in this issue with Wells, is because she's trying to get all these Southern women to join the WCTU because she wants it to be a national. She figures if we unify the South and the North, this is a time when everybody's talking about unification. We've got to move on from that war, you know, and come together as a country. And she's trying to bring everybody together. And so she's making compromises because of that. And it causes her to weaken her moral stance and to let something slip. So, you know, that idea of how do you make change? How do you get everyone going in the same direction? How do you keep them together? You know, we're all in the middle of trying to figure that, you know, anyone who's trying to make change today is struggling with that very same question. And yeah, I think it's an ongoing, it's human nature. And sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes you get it right, and you do make great change, and you do change things for lots of people. But sometimes you don't. So
Well, I think that we have
oh
come.
my gosh, look at the time.
we have come
Sorry.
But this has been an amazing conversation. I again want to thank Rima and Lori and Michelle for sharing their knowledge of these three incredible women, incredible humans, incredibly flawed and incredibly powerful at the same time. I also want to thank all of our co-sponsors. I want to thank Ross, Amanda Garcia, who's been behind the scenes, and all of our partners and collaborators, and thank our audience who has been with us, asking us great questions and sending us a lot of love in the chat as well. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, and wishing you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.